The most dangerous object at Los Alamos wasn't a nuclear bomb, it was a softball-sized sphere of plutonium sitting on a workbench. They called it the Demon Core, and it killed 2 scientists in exactly 9 months in almost the exact same way. Today I'm breaking down every major nuclear disaster in American history, starting with the one that proved we weren't ready for what we'd built. Los Alamos, 1945. Here's the thing about the Manhattan Project. Everyone focuses on the bombs, the mushroom clouds, but the first people killed by nuclear weapons weren't in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. They were American scientists standing in a lab, doing an experiment they'd done dozens of times before. On August 21st, 1945, physicist Harry Daghlian was stacking tungsten carbide bricks around the plutonium core to test its critical limits. He was placing the final brick when his instrument screamed that it would push the assembly supercritical. He pulled back and dropped it directly onto the core. The room flooded with a blue flash of radiation. Daghlian tore the bricks apart with his bare hands, but the damage was done. 25 days later, he became the first person in history killed by a criticality accident, and they kept using the same core. 9 months later, physicist Louis Slotin was demonstrating a criticality experiment using 2 beryllium hemispheres held apart by nothing but a flathead screwdriver. The screwdriver slipped. The core went supercritical again. Slotin threw the top hemisphere off with his bare hands, saving everyone in the room. He absorbed over 1,000 rads and died 9 days later. Both accidents happened on the 21st of the month. Both men died in the same hospital room. The medical documentation of their deaths, the skin degradation, the systematic organ failure became the first clinical study of acute radiation syndrome in history. Their suffering literally wrote the textbook. After Slotin's death, Los Alamos finally moved all criticality experiments to remote setups with quarter-mile separation between scientists and material. It only took 2 identical deaths to convince them that holding a nuclear core together with a screwdriver was a bad idea. But if you think the Demon Core was reckless, wait until you hear what was happening at Hanford, where the government was dumping hundreds of millions of gallons of radioactive waste directly into the ground. EBR-1-1955. On December 20th, 1951, a small reactor in the Idaho desert did something no machine had ever done before. The experimental breeder reactor 1 became the first nuclear reactor in history to generate usable electricity. 4 light bulbs powered entirely by nuclear fission, a genuinely historic moment. 4 years later, that same reactor melted itself from the inside out. On November 29th, 1955, scientists decided to run a high-risk experiment on the reactor's Mark II core. They wanted to understand why it behaved unstably during certain conditions. Here's the thing, the team knew going in that this experiment could destroy the core. That was considered an acceptable risk because the reactor was nearing the end of its useful life anyway. Trouble showed up faster than anyone expected. Reactor power shot up so quickly it went completely off the scales of the monitoring instruments. The supervisor immediately ordered a shutdown, but the operator, in the chaos of the moment, grabbed the slow-acting control rods instead of the emergency scram rod. By the time anyone corrected the mistake, core temperatures had surged past 1,100 degrees Celsius. Roughly 50% of the uranium fuel melted, but here's where it gets weird. There was no explosion, no fire, no sound. Engineer Ray Haraldson was working in his office nearby and had absolutely zero idea a meltdown had just occurred. He only found out when a technician walked in and told him. An entire reactor core silently destroyed itself. Then the Atomic Energy Commission blocked the team from opening the reactor for 5 months. Not because of radiation danger, because cracking it open might release gases that would compromise a separate program monitoring Soviet nuclear tests. Cold War surveillance took priority over investigating a meltdown. When they finally got inside, the uranium core had partially fused into a solid mass. The root cause turned out to be a design flaw where fuel rods could flex slightly, nudging power levels in ways nobody had accounted for. That discovery quietly informed every breeder reactor built afterward. But if a silent meltdown with 0 casualties sounds relatively tame, wait until you hear about the nuclear bomb that's still sitting at the bottom of the ocean off the coast of Georgia. SL-1, 1961. The SL-1 was supposed to be the safe one, a small, compact Army reactor sitting in the Idaho desert designed to power remote radar stations in Alaska and Greenland. Nothing fancy, nothing experimental. It had run without a single incident for over 2 years. And then on January 3rd, 1961, it became the site of the only fatal reactor explosion in American history. Here's what happened. A 3-man crew arrived at 9:01 p.m. to reconnect the main control rod after a routine Christmas shutdown. The task was simple. Move the rod about 4 inches. That's it. But for reasons that have never been fully determined, someone withdrew that rod approximately 20 inches. More than 5 times the intended distance. What followed took 4 milliseconds. The reactor went from cold shutdown to 20,000 megawatts. That's over 6,000 times its rated power. power. The water inside the core flashed to steam instantly, and a violent steam explosion launched the entire reactor vessel 9 feet off the ground. The 3 men never had a chance. Shift Supervisor Richard Legg was standing on top of the reactor when a control rod shield plug was ejected with enough force to impale him through the groin and out his shoulder, pinning him to the ceiling. John Burns was killed instantly when the blast drove a rib through his heart. Richard McKinley was found alive on the floor roughly 90 minutes later, moaning. He died shortly after. And here's where it gets haunting. Recovery teams who retrieved the bodies received significant radiation exposure themselves. But the forensic details are what stay with you. Radioactive copper from a cigarette lighter screw, irradiated gold from a wedding ring, activated brass from a watch buckle. The personal belongings of 3 dead men became the physical proof that the reactor had gone prompt critical. Their possessions told the story their bodies couldn't. But the most infuriating part, the design flaw that made all of this possible. One single control rod governed 80% of the reactor's activity. One rod. One person's mistake. That's all it took to trigger an uncontrollable chain reaction that killed 3 people in less time than it takes to blink. If you think that's the worst design failure on this list, wait until you hear what happened at 3 Mile Island, Santa Susana, 1959. Now forget the remote Idaho desert. Forget military bases in the middle of nowhere. This next one happened 30 miles northwest of downtown Los Angeles. The Santa Susana Field Laboratory sat tucked into the hills above Simi Valley, and during the Cold War, it housed multiple experimental nuclear reactors right in the backyard of suburban LA, and on July 13, 1959, one of them melted down. The sodium reactor experiment failed because of a contaminant called tetralin that had leaked into the sodium coolant system. Once inside, the tetralin decomposed into a tar-like substance that clogged the coolant channels and trapped heat with nowhere to go. Temperatures climbed. Fuel elements began to warp and crack. By the time it was over, 13 of the reactor's 43 fuel elements had sustained significant damage, with partial melting in those elements. Bad. But here's where it gets worse. The Atomic Energy Commission's official position was simple: no significant release of radioactive materials to the environment. Case closed. Except former workers directly contradicted that story. Testimony indicated that ventilation procedures were used to release radioactive gases from the building. That contaminated air was pushed out through exhaust systems and into the atmosphere for weeks, in whatever direction the wind happened to be blowing, over suburban Los Angeles. And the problems didn't stop with one incident. Workers at Santa Susana witnessed radioactive material being handled with shockingly little care across the facility over the years. Radioactive waste was burned in open pits, not contained, not filtered, burned. Some estimates suggest the 1959 Santa Susana meltdown released hundreds of times more radiation than 3 Mile Island. 3 Mile Island, the accident that became national news, triggered evacuations, and fundamentally changed how America thinks about nuclear power. But Santa Susana, it stayed secret for decades. No evacuation, no headlines, just families living nearby who had absolutely no idea. And speaking of things the government didn't want you to know about, the next disaster involves a reactor that didn't just fail quietly, it exploded. Tybee Island, 1958. On February 5th, 1958, the United States government dropped a nuclear bomb into the Atlantic Ocean, and then told everyone not to worry about it. Here's what happened. A routine training exercise off the coast of Georgia went sideways when an F-86 Sabre jet collided mid-air with a B-47 bomber. The F-86 pilot ejected and survived, but the B-47 was in bad shape. Major Howard Richardson was at the controls, and he had a serious problem. His damaged bomber was carrying a Mark 15 thermonuclear bomb, serial number 47782, and he needed to land that plane without it breaking loose and detonating on impact. Military policy was clear: crew survival comes first. So Richardson jettisoned the bomb into the ocean near Tybee Island, roughly 8 miles offshore. The crew watched it fall. No explosion when it hit the water. Richardson landed safely and was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for saving his aircraft and crew. Now, that bomb contained 400 pounds of conventional high explosives plus enriched uranium. If it had been fully armed and detonated above the water, you're looking at a fireball with a 1.2-mile radius and third-degree burns at 10 times that distance. But here's the thing. The Air Force told everyone for decades that the nuclear capsule had been removed before the flight and replaced with a dummy lead cap. No live weapon, nothing to worry about. Sleep tight, Georgia. Then 1994 happened. Declassified documents from a 1966 congressional testimony revealed that Assistant Secretary of Defense W.J. Howard had identified this as one of 2 incidents involving complete weapons. That means a fully armed thermonuclear bomb was dropped into the ocean, and the government knew for decades. A 2001 hydrographic survey found the bomb buried under 5 to 15 feet of silt in Wassaw Sound. The Air Force looked at the situation, considered the 400 pounds of conventional explosives still packed inside, and made their their official recommendation. Leave it there. That is their plan. Dropped it in 1958, and if you think a lost nuke is unsettling, wait until you hear about what happened when a reactor exploded in the middle of the Idaho desert. Goldsboro, 1961, 3 weeks. That's all the time between the SL-1 explosion killing 3 men in Idaho and the United States nearly nuking North Carolina. On January 24th, 1961, a B-52 Stratofortress carrying 2 Mark 39 thermonuclear bombs broke apart in mid-air over Goldsboro, North Carolina, dropping both weapons into the countryside below. Each bomb carried a yield of 3.8 megatons. To put that in perspective, that's roughly 250 times the power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, and there were 2 of them. Here's what happened. The B-52 linked up with a tanker for aerial refueling, and the tanker crew noticed a fuel leak in the bomber's right wing. Refueling was immediately aborted, and the crew was ordered to hold position off the coast and burn off fuel before landing, but the leak got worse, fast. The aircraft hemorrhaged 37,000 pounds of fuel in just 3 minutes. As the bomber descended through 10,000 feet trying to reach Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, the crew lost all control. The plane went into an uncontrolled spin, and the pilot ordered everyone to bail out. Of the 8 crew members on board, 5 survived, 3 died, and one of the survivors, Lieutenant Adam Maddox, bailed out through the top hatch without an ejection seat, making him one of the rarest survival cases in Air Force history. Now here's where it gets complicated, because the 2 bombs had completely different fates. Bomb number 1 deployed its parachute and floated down relatively intact. Sounds like the safe outcome, right? It wasn't. A Sandia investigation confirmed that this bomb had gone through a normal arming sequence. Multiple safety mechanisms had failed. The only thing that prevented a 3.8 megaton nuclear detonation over North Carolina was a single device called the MC-772 arm/safe switch. One switch, that's it. Bomb number 2 hit the ground in free fall, no parachute. It punched a crater 5 feet deep and 9 feet wide. But here's the kicker. Its timer circuit had only run 12 to 15 seconds before impact, and the high voltage thermal battery needed for detonation never had time to activate. That tiny gap in timing is the only reason it didn't go off. Goldsboro matters because it proved something the military didn't want anyone to know. The layered safety systems on nuclear weapons were not as redundant as they'd publicly claimed. With one bomb, a single switch stood between a quiet night in North Carolina and a 3.8 megaton fireball. That's not speculation. That's documented in the Sandia report. But if you think dropping 2 nuclear bombs on American soil is as bad as it gets, wait until you hear what happened when an entire reactor started melting down in the middle of Pennsylvania. 3 Mile Island. This is the one everyone knows, but most people get the story wrong because the real terror of 3 Mile Island isn't what happened, it's what almost happened and how close it came without anyone realizing it in real time. March 28th, 1979, 4 a.m. Unit 2 at 3 Mile Island is running at 97% power when a failure in the secondary cooling system kicks off a cascade that nobody in that control room is prepared for. The pressurizer relief valve opens exactly as designed to vent excess pressure. Good, except it never closes again. Coolant starts bleeding out of the reactor continuously, and here's the critical detail. The operators had no direct indicator telling them the valve was stuck open. As far as they knew, everything was working. By 4:11 a.m., the pressurizer relief tank overfills. Radioactive coolant starts leaking into the containment building. Alarms are going off, temperatures are climbing, and the data on the control panels is painting a picture that the operators fundamentally misread. At 5:20 a.m., they make the call that turns a bad situation into a nightmare. They shut down the reactor coolant pumps, assuming natural circulation would keep water flowing through the core. It didn't. Steam blocked flow through the core entirely. By 6 a.m., the top of the reactor core was exposed. Superheated steam started reacting with the zircaloy cladding on the fuel rods, producing hydrogen gas and generating even more heat. That hydrogen is believed to have caused a small explosion inside the containment building that afternoon, and the fuel itself began to melt. When investigators finally got a full picture of the damage, what they found was staggering. Approximately half the reactor core had melted. Around 20 short tons of uranium had pooled at the bottom of the reactor vessel as corium. 90% of fuel rod cladding had failed. Half the core was gone, and nobody outside the plant knew the full extent of it for days. But here's the thing, the containment building held. Health studies conducted over the following decade found no statistically significant increase in cancer rates or mortality among residents living near the plant. The real legacy of 3 Mile Island wasn't radiation, it was institutional. The nuclear industry formed the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations in direct response. New training accreditation requirements were introduced, and federal regulators restructured oversight of commercial plants from the ground up. 3 Mile Island is one of the rare disasters where the system actually learned something. The industry didn't just move on, it fundamentally changed how it operated, and that's worth acknowledging because the next 2 incidents on this list didn't get that kind of resolution. Damascus, 1980. On September 18, 1980, a propellant transfer system team was checking oxidizer tank pressure on a Titan II missile sitting inside Launch Complex 374-7 near Damascus, Arkansas. Sitting on top of that missile was a W-53 nuclear warhead, 9 megatons. That's roughly 600 times the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, and it was the single largest thermonuclear warhead in the entire United States arsenal. What happened next is the most absurd near-apocalypse in American history. A crew member dropped a socket. An 8-pound socket wrench socket slipped from his hand, fell about 80 feet through the silo, ricocheted off multiple platforms, and punched a hole straight through the missile's first stage fuel tank. That's it. That was the trigger for everything that followed. Highly volatile propellant immediately began flooding the enclosed silo. The crew was evacuated. Air Force Security Police cleared residents in Van Buren and Faulkner counties for at least 5 miles in every direction, displacing roughly 1,000 people from their homes in the middle of the night. Water was pumped into the 8-story underground silo to try and dilute the fuel. It didn't work. At approximately 3 a.m. on September 19th, the missile exploded. Flames reached more than 300 feet into the night sky. The 740-ton launch duct closure door was blown 200 feet into the air and landed 600 feet away. Let that sink in. A 740-ton concrete door, launched like a bottle cap. But here's where it gets terrifying. The W-53 warhead was found approximately 100 feet from the facility's entry gate. Its safety features held no nuclear detonation, no significant radioactive release from the warhead itself. But the casing was breached and the tritium boost canister was leaking. Senior Airman David Livingston died from his injuries at the hospital. Sergeant Jeff Kennedy was blown 150 feet from the silo and survived with a broken leg. 21 others were injured. Now let me explain what would have happened if those safety features had failed. Every estimate agrees on one thing. A 9 megaton detonation at Damascus would have been the largest explosion in recorded human history. The fatal burn radius alone stretched 20 miles. Radioactive fallout was projected to reach the East Coast, the West Coast, Canada, or Mexico depending on wind direction. The entire state of Arkansas and every surrounding state would have been devastated, and the cause of all of it was a dropped socket. One wrong tool, one slip of the hand, and a quarter of the United States nearly ceased to exist. That is not hyperbole. That is a direct calculation from the documented yield and blast radius. A socket wrench socket, 8 pounds, nearly triggered the single largest explosion in human history. Hanford Site. Every other disaster on this list has something in common. A start time, an explosion, a meltdown, a moment where everything went wrong. Hanford doesn't have that. Hanford is 46 years of deliberate decisions that created the most contaminated nuclear site in the Western Hemisphere. And it's still not over. In 1943, the federal government selected a stretch of south central Washington along the Columbia River for a top-secret Manhattan project facility. Before a single reactor was built, 2 entire towns were forcibly evacuated and the Wanapum Nation was displaced from their ancestral land. At its peak, Hanford employed 51,000 workers operating 9 nuclear reactors. It produced the plutonium for the Trinity test and the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. This was the engine of the atomic age. The reactors themselves were massive. Rectangular graphite cores measuring 28 feet deep by 36 feet wide by 36 feet tall, weighing 1,200 short tons each, penetrated by 2004 aluminum tubes holding 200 short tons of uranium. The components were so radioactive that workers handled them remotely using periscopes and early closed-circuit television. Nobody was getting near this stuff by choice. But here's where it gets dark. The waste generated over those 46 years is almost incomprehensible. Hundreds of millions of gallons of radioactive liquid were injected directly into the ground through wells, trenches, and buried drums. 177 large underground tanks held additional waste, and the reactor cooling water discharged straight into the Columbia River for decades. Here's a detail nobody expects. In March 1945, a Japanese balloon bomb struck a high-tension power line feeding the reactors and caused a brief shutdown. The bomb failed to explode and the line wasn't badly damaged, but Hanford holds the distinction of being the only U.S. nuclear facility to ever come under direct enemy attack. In 1976, a glove box at the 242Z Americium Recovery Facility exploded, seriously injuring worker Harold McCluskey with americium and plutonium contamination. That accident triggered reviews that led to the closure of most plutonium finishing plant operations by 1978. Hanford officially transitioned to cleanup in 1989 under a legally binding tri-party agreement between the Department of Energy, Washington State, and the EPA that was supposed to fix things, but cleanup is currently estimated to be only 1/3 complete, with deadlines now pushed to at least 2047. The Columbia River, which provides drinking water and supports ecosystems across the entire Pacific Northwest, remains at risk from groundwater contamination that is still migrating toward it right now. Every other entry on this list happened, past tense. Hanford is not a historical disaster, it is an ongoing one, and the full bill has not come due yet. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.